So now that we've got our everything set up with our keeping track of our lives and our score, we need a way to make it so that our asteroids spawn so that we can have a game where it gets progressively more difficult and the asteroids are created kind of randomly. We don't have to make new scenes where they're placed in and everything like that. So I think the easiest place to put all this information is going to be in the level manager script because the level manager already keeps track of our lives, it keeps track of our score. So the level manager is really a good place to keep track of anything that's going to be a constant throughout our game. And our spawning, we want to be pretty much constant. We want it to be, well, not like it's going to constantly spawn, but it's going to constantly be present in our scene. So in this case, I think it'll be a good thing to do. All right. So right now, I don't need this anymore. I'm going to go through and do some code cleanup. So I don't need points per comment anymore. Yeah, I already cleaned up some other stuff, so we're much better now. So we need to have, I'm going to do some labeling because, you know, I like to keep things organized, and that's what we're kind of practicing here in this particular game. This header I'm going to call UI, because this has all the stuff that has to do with the UI. And then I'm going to make another header, and this one's going to be called spawns, or just spawn. Everything that controls the spawn of the asteroid is going to go here. So I'm going to set up some variables, and I'll explain them a little bit more as we use them. I'm just going to set them up for now, and then I'll explain why we set them later, basically. So the first thing is a game object array, and it's going to be called comets. Now we're making this an array, so just like normally we drag in a game object and we don't have the array brackets on it, this time it's an array because if we want it to spawn multiple comets randomly, we need to make sure it's an array that it can draw from. We're going to need a serialized field. It's going to be an integer, and we're going to call this one, made it capitalized, wave counter, because every time our waves go up, we want to make it a step more difficult. And so to keep track of how many waves we have, we need something to store that in. Serialized, I just can't type today. Okay, serialized fields. Can't type and talk at the same time. Okay, an integer, comet count increase, which we're going to use to control how fast our waves multiply in difficulty. Another serialized field. This one's going to be a float instead of an integer. Spawn speed increase equals 0.1f so that we can make things go progressively faster. Serialized field. Boop, boop, boop. Vector 2. So we're making a new vector 2 in this case, and we're going to call this one spawn values. This is going to be, it's going to put in the inspector an X and a Y space that we can use to put in spawn values so that we can determine where on the screen our asteroids are allowed to spawn. Oops. Need to have my brackets. There are so many things on here that it's just hard to keep track of doing everything. We need another integer that's going to be called comet count. It's going to keep track of how many comets we should have spawning in our waves. Serialized field. We're almost done. This one's going to be float spawn weight. This one is going to be a float called start weight. And this one is going to be another float called wave weight. Now, these right here are kind of new concepts, but also kind of things that we've done before. We're going to use these in a coroutine so that instead of saying wait 3 seconds, we're going to have in the inspector a place where we can set a specific amount of time and adjust it So basically, instead of having a magic number like we do in our player where it says specifically wait 3 seconds and then turn off the shield and then you're not invulnerable anymore. This one, it just makes it so we can customize it from the inspector and change it from there. So whenever we start our script, we need to start the coroutine that we're going to make that's going to control our spawning. And we're going to call it spawn waves because spawn waves just makes sense as a name, right? I think I'm going to put it right here at the top. iEnumerator, just how we start every coroutine. Spawn waves, parentheses, curly brackets. Okay. Interestingly, the first thing we're going to do before we do anything else is we're going to go ahead and say yield return new, wait 4 seconds, and we're going to use the start wait variable that we put up top. So it's basically saying we're going to wait for whatever this value is. So in this case, this is going to be the first thing it does whenever it starts. So it's basically giving the player time to figure out what they're doing before the asteroids start spawning on them. It's your start at the beginning of the wait. And then we're going to use some new stuff inside of our coroutine that you have not used before. We're going to use a for loop, and we're going to contain our for loop in a while statement. So we're going to say while something is true, we're going to run a for loop. So while, and in parentheses, true. And we want to do something. So for, and then in a for statement, in a for loop, you have 3 conditions that you have to put inside of it. You have to, well, not have to, but you can put inside of it. So the you set up a variable, you give it a conditional statement, and then you can tell it to adjust the variable. So in this case, we're just going to say int, and then I equals, not minus, 0. And instead of commas, like most things, this is going to have semicolons at the ends of these statements. When I is less than the comet count, and then another semicolon, and then we're going to say I plus plus. And then a for statement after you have all that is going to have curly brackets with stuff inside of it. So for loops are very confusing, and I'm going to link this information in our classroom. This is a For Dummies article, how to construct a basic for loop. But basically, the setup, the exit condition for when it finishes, and the part that loops the statement when the statements are repeated. So this is an example that I found quite helpful. So in this one, they are simulating whenever in grade school, if you've ever seen The Simpsons, that Bart Simpson, when he gets in trouble, he has to write on the chalkboard a bunch of lines over and over and over again. It's an old school punishment. So this is saying basically that this code will do that, but it will do it in code. So it's going to say for C that's less than 100, we're going to loop through the statement and add 1 to our count every time we loop through it. So it's going to go through this once, and then it's going to say C is now equal to 1. Is C still less than 100? And if so, we're going to loop through it again. And it just keeps doing that over and over and over again until it gets to 100 lines. So I hope that makes a little bit of sense. There's also a video on Unity called For Loops, or all about loops. It's got for loops. It's got the while loop, which we are messing with as well with our while this is true, which in our case, we're using while this is true so that it continues to loop infinitely because it's always going to be true. A do while loop and a for each loop, which are all very useful types of loops, and we'll probably use them in the future. But right now, we're only really concerned with the for loop, which is all about setting an integer checking if that integer is less than or more than or equal to another thing. And while that statement is true, continuing on, and every time it loops through, it adds to that integer or subtracts from that integer. It really depends, but in our case, adding to that integer. And I hope that makes sense. I know it's not super clear, but once you get a little more comfortable with for loops, I think it will make sense to you. So we need to set up our spawn positions of our asteroids. Where do we want them to land on our screen? So in our case, it's a vector 2. I'm going to call this spawn position. And that's going to be equal to a new vector 2. This should look familiar. This right here should be pretty comfortable. And then random.range, and we want to say, in parentheses in our random.range, negative spawn values dot x, because our spawn values are going to be in our inspector, to spawn values x. And if you remember, we've used this same concept exactly, basically with our screen wrapping code, where we said between negative x value and regular x value. And then comma outside of that parenthesis. It's hard to keep everything straight sometimes. And then spawn values. Just remembered we need to do the random.range. Random.range. Negative spawn values y dot y. Spawn values dot y. Semicolon. Okay. That was a kind of a mouthful, and if your screen is got this wrapping to the next line, that's fine. But basically we're saying pick a spot anywhere between whatever x values we give you and the negative version of it, whatever y and the negative version of it, and that's where our spawn position is going to be. We want to say quaternion dot spawn rotation and equals quaternion dot identity. Just saying, like, take our spawn rotation and make it its normal rotation identity. Instantiate. And then we want to, in this part, make our comets. So we're going to instantiate comets, which, remember, whenever we initialized that above, was an array. So we're going to say random dot range. So it will select it randomly, and it'll do it between 0 and comets dot length. Now remember, we could hard code a number in there, but we don't actually need to, or we really want to, because it will just look for the length of it and choose to do it that way. If it were, if we put a specific number in there, say we knew we were only ever going to have 2 comets, we could put a 1 in there, but we don't generally want to hard code numbers in like that. We want to say spawn position, and we want to make it spawn rotation. That's all in the commas? Yes. Okay. Gonna have to investigate what's going on with that in a minute here. And then well, since this isn't a coroutine, we can use yield wait 4 seconds. So we're going to use yield return new wait 4 seconds. And then we are going to use, up at the top, we had our spawn wait. We're going to use that to say how long between waves we want to wait. And then we're going to subtract, in parentheses, our wave counter multiplied by our spawn speed increase, so that it will get progressively difficult, like so. And then outside of everything, we want to do yield, return, new, wait for seconds, and this is going to be wave wait. And then every time our wave ends, we want to take our wave counter and add to it, so plus plus. We're going to add 1 every time. I'm going to comment this out for a second because I know it's not working, and I'm going to say quaternion identity. I don't know if we really needed to declare the quaternion up here. I think I can just say quaternion identity down here. So I hope all of this made sense, but let's see. Let's go into the inspector and kind of mess around with all the variables we've created. Okay. So in our level manager, we should have a bunch of new values. So remember that vector2 spawn values automatically generates an X and a Y space. And then we've got a place to drop in our comments. We've got our wave counter, which should start at 0, correct? Because we don't have any waves. Our comment count increase is how much it increases per wave. Our spawn speed increase is how fast how much it speeds up every time. And then our comment count, spawn wait, start wait, and wave wait. So let's start at the top here. So first thing, we need to put our comets in. So let's go to our prefabs, and I don't want it to spawn little guys. So I'm just going to put in my big brown and my big red. So now I have 2 in there. That's fine. Wave counter is going to be 0. These 2 are fine because I set those in there. Our spawn values. I'm going to go ahead and steal the X and the Y from the ship wrapping and kind of just say anywhere between 5 and 9 is probably okay for things to spawn. I don't necessarily want them to spawn off of the screen because then they'll just end up wrapping themselves around, and it seems like extra processing my game doesn't really need. So it'll spawn in from anywhere around the edges here. Our comet count, let's say 10. Spawn wait, between spawn waves, let's say, I don't know, 2 seconds. At the very beginning, I'm going to give you 1 second, and between waves, say 4. So let's give this a try. Let's see what this does. Right now we have 2 comets on our screen, and they're just going to be around. You'll notice I now have some more comets spawning in. So it's going to get progressively more and more crazy in here, right? But that is exactly what we want. So this seems to be working pretty well. I'm getting new comets, definitely more. So I've got small brown. These are all clones, basically. I killed off my original ones. So I've just got clones floating around my screen. I'm just going to lay out a layer of bullets here. And now I've destroyed myself. I've gone to game over. All right, perfect. So we've now set up a wave system so that our comets will spawn in at random, and it will progressively get more and more crazy as far as comets. And we will tweak all these numbers in our polishing stage, but for now it is a testable state, so we don't have to worry about making it any better. So I'm going to apply all this back to the prefab, because you remember you always want to do that, and I know it's functional, so I'm not going to worry about whether or not it's going to work on the prefab, so it should be fine. So yeah, that's where we are with that. Now that we've got our asteroids spawning in randomly, we've got movement, we've got shooting, we're going to have to move on a little bit to some of our extra stuff. So on our game outline, we've got all of our core elements. The ship can fly around the screen wraps, the player can shoot bullets, the asteroids spawn, the asteroids are breakable, and a score is kept. We've got all of that. We also have a life system already. We also have our animation and our increasing difficulty and some of our sound effects, but not all of them. So we're getting pretty close to the end game here. So I want to add in some power-ups to our gameplay that will affect how things are. And we're going to use probably some bool statements to say whether or not the power-up is active, and if it is, what to change. Some neat things we might consider doing are maybe a shield power-up, maybe a bullet speed power up, or something that makes it so that our ship is, like, I don't know, really tiny so it's easy to dodge asteroids. I don't know. There's lots of different options for power ups, and you can make your power ups do whatever you want, because some things may make sense for your theme of game that don't make sense for mine. So that's what we'll probably look into. Also, sound effects. We need to find a background song to go with our game to make it feel really polished. I trust that since you did that in the last section, you can go ahead and find a song and go ahead and put it in your game. So I'm going to leave you with that challenge. Find an audio clip that you want to use for your game. And if you think back, remember there was a piece of code we commented out on our level manager that made it so that we could play audio attached to our level manager. So if you go back into that code and uncomment it out, it should still be working just fine. You just need to drag your audio source into your object. So I'm going to let you do that before I even come back, and I'm going to trust that you can figure that one out, and then we will move on.